about the future of war. And more than that, they're part, as Russians, part of a national culture which places a very high premium on that kind of holistic thinking. Basically really values the person who takes a step back and figures out how all the pieces fit together. So it makes perfect sense that the Soviets are the first to look at these emerging technologies and say, wow, if they're ever combined in a coherent way, it's going to change forever the way war is fought. Then there's the United States. What's distinctive about the United States military culture? Well, it's highly decentralized, right? You've got the Marines and the Air Force and the Navy and the Army, and they're four completely separate services with different headquarters in different parts of the country. They don't like each other. They never talk to each other. They pursue their own agendas completely independently, and they have all kinds of ties to a highly entrepreneurial, highly innovative private sector that will make every new tool they want to make. So it makes perfect sense when you think about that kind of decentralized, highly entrepreneurial environment. It makes perfect sense that the Americans would be the first ones to come up with all these new gadgets, right? No one's better at coming up with new gadgets than the Americans. Then there's the Israelis. What had the Israelis just been through in 1982? Well, their previous military experience had been the 1973 Yom Kippur War. What happened in Yom Kippur? On the first day of battle, they lost 15% of their air force to surface-to-air missiles fired at them by the Egyptians. One of the most devastating moments in Israeli military history. They were humiliated, humbled by a weapon they didn't think posed them a threat at all. Meanwhile, their entire military strategy was built around the strategic advantage represented by their air force. So they panicked. All of a sudden, the thing that they thought that they had as an advantage over their allies was being reduced by the power of this new thing called a surface-to-air missile. And so over the course of the years that followed the Yom Kippur War, they engaged in this frantic, desperate search for a solution. In this little, beleaguered country, surrounded by hostile enemies, and they're terrified. So what do? Well, they scour the earth for some kind of answer to this problem, and they find the Soviet thinking on the future of war, and they think, oh, that's really interesting. And they go to America, and they say, oh my goodness, you've got this thing called a drone. That could be really interesting. Oh, AWACS would fit us perfectly. And precision-guided missiles, oh my goodness, that solves our problem. And they put all those things together in a brilliantly improvisational way, and that's where you get the 1982 Baccaveli turkey shoot, right? Now, this guy Diemedensky's big point about those three cultures is that they're mutually exclusive. By being good at one of those things prevents you from being good at something else. If you are a centralized, highly intellectualized military culture like the Soviet Union, it makes you really good at thinking through the philosophical implications of some kind of technological revolution in warfare, but it makes you really bad at putting it into action. Why? You're a big, clumsy, centralized military bureaucracy. The last thing you can do is to be nimble and improvisational and innovative in actually fighting wars. Meanwhile, look at the United States. They're the first in developing all these technologies. Why? Because they have this decentralized military system where everyone has their own private agenda and makes all kinds of informal and highly innovative ties with entrepreneurial firms in the military contracting world. But that very same thing makes it really hard for you to put all those pieces together in combat. Really hard to put together an integrated, conceptual, strategic military fighting force when you've got four different services off in their own little corner doing their own thing. The thing, in other words, that makes those two countries first at thinking about the idea, first at building all those tools, makes it impossible for them to actually be the implementer. That there is, in other words, a specificity to cultures of innovation that imposes a cost on first. Being first at that idea thinking, being first at that gadget making, makes it really hard for you to be the one who actually makes sense and practical use of these technologies. Let me give you another example of this, another story that I think illustrates this. It's one of the great stories from the history of Silicon Valley, one of the most famous stories. And it's the story of Xerox PARC. Xerox PARC, of course, is the legendary research and development organization founded by Xerox in the early 70s, when Xerox was the preeminent high-tech firm of its age. Founded by Xerox in Palo Alto to imagine the future. And they built this gorgeous modernist building, and they nestle it in the hills above Stanford University. And they go out and they hire 60 or 70 of the most brilliant computer scientists in the world. And they give them their own palatial private office, and they double their salaries, and they give them unlimited research budgets, and they say to them, take all the time you want, we just want you to imagine the future of the office. And that's exactly what they do. Virtually everything that we associate with the computer age, the personal computer age, is invented at Xerox PARC in the 1970s. They're the first ones to really build a functional, integrated personal computer. Right? It's called the Alto. They're the first one. They invent the laser printer. They invent the Ethernet. They invent Windows. They invent the graphical user interface, the idea of having icons on a screen manipulated by a mouse. I could go on and on. Everything comes from Xerox PARC. Well, in December of 1979, Xerox PARC is visited by a young entrepreneur who has a little company down the road in Cupertino. And the entrepreneur is 24 years old, and his name is Steve Jobs. And the company that he's invented is Apple, which is this little startup, makes little computers. And all of his engineers have told him, you've got to go and see what's going on at Xerox PARC. So he goes to Xerox PARC on that December day, and he gets a tour of the facility, right? And they show him this gadget and this gadget. And finally they come to the Alto, this personal computer, and he looks at this little thing next to it and says, what's that? And they say, well, that's a mouse. And then he looks at the screen and says, what are those? And they said, well, those are icons, right? Everyone to that point, at least in his computers that he'd been making, are computers where when you wanted the computer to do something, you typed in on a command line, and you hit, the whatever it was, and that whatever button corresponded back then, and it was this long, complex process. And they showed how actually you could do it way easier. You just move your mouse, or click on an icon, and boom, it's done. And he can't believe what he's seeing. He's literally floored. And he starts jumping up and down and saying, oh my goodness, this is the future of the computer. I mean, this is the way everything's going to be. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Why haven't you done anything with this? And they kind of look at him like they don't know what he's talking about. And he jumps in his car and he races back to Cupertino, and he goes to his engineers who are in the midst of working on a new computer that's been called the Lisa, which is a very conventional computer. And he says, stop everything. Throw it out. We're starting over from scratch. We're going to do a graphical user interface. And they go, what's that? It's icons on the screen. They say, but you told us to do this the other way. He says, I was wrong, right? We're using this idea. And he goes to his designers and he says, I want a mouse. And they say, what's a mouse? We can get you a mouse. Run around the office. No. I want a little thing. I want a little box, and I want to move it around and have it move the cursor on the screen. And only I saw it at Xerox PARC. Only theirs cost $300. I want mine to cost $15. And I want to work for a year, and I want to work on Formica and whatever surface you can imagine. And they go and they make that, and they finally put all those things together, the graphical user interface and the mouse. And Apple comes out with the Macintosh. Right? Still the most iconic product in the history of Apple Computer, one of the most iconic products in the history of Silicon Valley, and certainly the breakthrough that launches Apple onto the trajectory that they have been on ever since. Well, think about that story along the lines of the story I just told you about RMA, right? It's very, very similar. Xerox has built a culture for invention. They're the United States. They have brought together a bunch of really, really brilliant people, given them lots and lots of money and lots of time and a huge research budget and a palatial headquarters in the hills above Stanford University, and they've told them to do everything they can to imagine the future, and that's exactly what they do. But Xerox ends up capitalizing on none of it. And why is that? Because a culture built for invention is not optimized for implementation. What happens when you get a bunch of really brilliant PhDs together and ask them to design a computer? Well, they design the computer that the Xerox came up with and finally went to market with in 1980, called the Xerox Star, which cost $16,000 in 1980 money, right? That's what happens when you have PhD geniuses design a computer. They gave you a perfect computer that cost $16,000, right? And what happens when you're Xerox and you're steeped in a culture of sending tons and tons of genius PhDs to work on hugely complex topics? Well, you think that's a good idea. And it takes you 10 years to take an idea from its inception to implementation. Meanwhile, what was the real computer business like? Well, it was a business where you couldn't sell anything for $16,000. And we're 10 years from idea to development is a ludicrously long time. And who understands that? Well, a 24-year-old guy who's running a startup, who doesn't have unlimited budgets, who doesn't have the luxury of time. He's desperate, right? He's put out a computer called the Apple II, which isn't a very good computer. He's building another one called the Lisa, which doesn't look like it's going to be that much better, right? He's Israel. He's running around desperately trying to find an answer to his problem, and he sees it, and boom, light bulb goes off. You know, you can do a kind of perfect RNA analysis of the history of the mouse. It's kind of interesting. The mouse, the concept of the mouse is invented by a guy named Doug Engelbart in the late 60s at SRI in Stanford, California. Engelbart is Russian. The first operational mouse is made at enormous cost and expense and brilliance at Xerox PARC in the 1970s. Xerox PARC is the United States. The first commercial mouse is put into practice at a cost of $15 by Steve Jobs. He is Israel, right? He's the last to the party, but he's the most successful one, just as Israel was the most successful one. In fact, when you look at the history of Apple, of course, they're always last to the party, right? He wasn't just last with Windows and last with the mouse. He was way late with the smartphone. He was way late with the MP3 player, and he was way late with the iPad. Right? This is a man who was made a business out of being late, right? Not being early. So when I was at a dinner party in Palo Alto, and someone told me this story. It's possibly apocryphal, but Larry Ellison, the head of Oracle Software, bought himself a G5, and he's a very kind of hands-on, practical engineering, visual kind of guy, and he looks at the interior of the G5 and he decides, it's all wrong. They don't understand how to do a plane. And so he brings in craftsmen from Italy and imports rare materials from Africa, spends $1 gazillion in a year completely rethinking the structure of the cabin and puts this special African hardwood on the walls and redoes the doors so they glide in and out, and there's like one button that opens and one button that closes, and spends all this time until it's perfect. He calls up his friend, his best friend, Steve Jobs, and says, I want you to come and see my plane. Jobs shows up, walks into the plane, and wearing his turtleneck. Sits in like the captain's chair, like this, and just looks, says nothing. Half an hour, just looking. Then quietly leaves, goes home, buys himself a G5, spends the next year spending $1 gazillion, like making it to his specifications. Calls up his friend Mary Allison and says, I want you to come and see my plane. Right? Ellison goes over, climbs the stairs, walks in, and it's exactly like his plane. Every single thing he did a year ago, Jobs had done with his plane, with two exceptions. One is that, you know how Ellison had used that fine African hardwood grain? It wasn't quite right. And what Jobs done is change it just a little bit, and actually the effect was way better. And also, remember how the doors that opened and shut, Ellison, two buttons, one to open, one to close? Jobs has one button, and when it's open, you hit it, when it closes, when it's closed, you hit it, and it opens. And Ellison looks around and realizes there's these subtle differences, and he buries his head in his hands, and he says, your plane is better. This is the man, Steve Jobs, who is the archetypal entrepreneur of our age, right? And he is not an innovator, right? He's the guy who comes second or third and makes it better. And that, to me, is an extraordinarily important observation. Now, let's think about this. A couple of implications of this phenomenon. Why is it? So what are the reasons why, additional reasons why? What sort of lessons can we draw from this paradoxical fact that the people who seem to make all the money are the ones who come along second or third, and not first? The first thing is that I think it's a lot easier to figure out technological solutions than it is to figure out what customers want, right? So if you look at the rise of the personal computer, what you see is, Xerox's assumption in the early days of Xerox PARC is that what they're building is an office application, an enterprise application. They're going to sell it the same way they sell their huge Xerox machines to very large corporate clients. And that's why they're thinking $16,000 for a computer machine, right? Because they're used to selling copiers for $40,000. And that's because, the reason they have that assumption is not because they are stupid, but because at that point in the early 1970s, we didn't know what the computer was going to be for, the personal computer. No one did. Least of all consumers. It took a while. It took 5, 6, 7 years of people playing with the idea of the personal computer to make them understand that this had extraordinary potential in the consumer marketplace. So who gets the value of that learning curve? Well, the person who waits, right? The person who's third in or second in, not first in. Steve Jobs, who's able to observe with the benefit of hindsight what has been learned about the practical value of the personal computer, the potential of the personal computer over the course of the second half of the 1970s. You can see the same thing with social media. Who's the first big player in social media? Right? Well, it's Friendster. What is Friendster? It's basically a souped-up dating site. Their impression was that the thing that we would want out of a social networking website was a way to connect with other people who we wanted to sleep with. Right? Now, they added some other bells and whistles, but at the core, their thinking was about romance. Well, then along came number 2, which was MySpace, which said, actually, it's going to be a little bit more than that. You probably want to have a place where you can put your music, or you can sort of dump various artifacts of your life, and as a better way of representing who you are to people who want to sleep with you. Right? Well, what happens over the course of the public experimentation with social media over the course of those first 5 years? We discovered it's much more than that. That in our first imagining, we only captured a fraction of the real utility of these websites. So Facebook, which comes along third, late to the party, is the one that gets the benefit of that learning and understands it's not about dating, it's not about a place just to dump your personal artifacts. It's actually an informational platform, a wholly new media platform that can compete with all of the existing platforms and win. See the same thing with the e-reader. Exactly the same story. Who's first with the e-reader? Sony. And by the way, if you go back and look at those Sony e-readers, they were amazing. As a piece of technology, they still remain a kind of brilliant accomplishment. Did they transform the marketplace? No. Why? Because at the time that Sony came out with their e-reader, the time they pioneered that market, none of us understood what the e-reader was all about. We thought it was about the piece of technology we hold in our hands. It's not. It's about a seamless connectivity to a digital bookstore. It's about access to the books. And if you can deliver seamless access to the books, then you'll win the day. Who gets the benefit of that understanding? Well, Amazon does, right? Why? Because they're not first. Because they're third. Because they come in late and get to get the full benefit of that necessary process of evolution. Second thought. The thing that's really interesting when you look at the Apple and RMA examples is you realize how much innovation, or profitable innovation, the people who make the most of new ideas, how much that is a mass strategy and not an elite strategy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at this, a lot of really great thinking that's gone on, obviously, about the Industrial Revolution. We've had a couple hundred years to think about it, after all. And one of the questions people in the Industrial Revolution who study it always ask is, why does it happen in England? What's England's great advantage? And there's a series of really great papers that have been written by this historian named Joe Morcor. And what he says is, he sort of divides, along the same lines that I've been talking about, he divides technological innovation into 3 steps. Inventors, and then tweakers, and then implementers. And he says, is England's advantage with inventors? Do they have more of the people who make that big conceptual breakthrough? And the answer is no. They have a lot of great inventors, but that's not where their real advantage is. Their real advantage is with the tweakers and the implementers. They don't have more geniuses than Germany or France or the United States or Belgium or whoever else in that era. What they have are more of the people who take an idea and play with it and work with it and evolve it and tweak it until it becomes something that makes a big impact. Classic example of this is the steam engine. Right? Famously, the steam engine is invented by James Watt. He's the great inventor. Well, what does Watt do with the steam engine? He basically doubles its efficiency. So there's some crude steam engines up around that point. Watt comes in with this bold idea about a condenser, I think. Someone's going to correct me, I'm not sure. And he basically turns the steam engine from something that has, you measure the efficiency of a steam engine. It's a little fact you can take home. In what's called duty, which is how many pounds of water can be pumped per bushel of coal. So the duty of steam engines is at 10 million. Watt doubles it to 20 million. That's his contribution. Then the tweakers and the implementers take over. And what do? They take it from 20 million to 100 million. They increase it fivefold. They're the ones who bring about the payday, right? And the Industrial Revolution starts to really benefit from the steam engine. Not when Watt comes along with his steam engine, but years afterwards when the benefit of all of that tweaking takes place. And you start to see engines that can pump out 100 million pounds of duty. And who are those tweakers and implementers? Well, they're not geniuses. They didn't go to elite schools. They don't have, like James Watt does, a statue in St. Paul's Cathedral. They're not famous in the history books. We basically have lost, we don't even know who they were. But they were not a dozen of them, they were thousands of them. And they were working in their garages or their workshops, and they were sharing ideas informally. And little by little, they took a technology that was really promising but wasn't doing anyone any good, and turned it into the most transformational technology in the Industrial Revolution. That the people, that in other words, the inventor, the person who first gets all the glory, but the value is being extracted surprisingly far downfield by someone who's not inventing, but who is tweaking. Same thing, see this with Google. Does Google invent search? No. Way late to the party. Remember Alta Vista and Lycos and About and all these other people? Google comes along relatively late in the day. And do Sergey Brin and Larry Page ever have some brilliant conceptual breakthrough? Were they sitting under the apple tree in Palo Alto, and an apple falls and hits them on the head? Did Larry Page get in the bathtub one day and realize that, oh my goodness, it's rising as I get in, and therein lies the key to search? No! They're not conceptual breakthrough guys. They're tweakers. But the tweaking is where the value is. It's the tweaking that turns search from this kind of cool thing you could do on the internet into one of the most profitable businesses in the world. Third and last point, and in many ways, to my mind, the most interesting of the three lessons, and that is, it's really fascinating to me to compare the material circumstances of inventors and of tweakers and implementers, of the people who come first versus the people who come third, right? If you go back to RMA, what is the most striking thing about the two pioneers, the Soviet Union and the United States? They're rich. They have infinite resources. They have an endless supply of geniuses they can throw at the problem, right? The Soviet Union has the luxury, the leisure, to have a group of intellectuals at the core of their military establishment to sit and think in a deep philosophical way about the future of war. The United States has billions of dollars available to go around America and develop the most extraordinary technologies, right? With no constraints whatsoever. What is Israel? An incredibly constrained country. Country don't have any money at all. Doesn't have the luxury of time. Are you kidding me? They just nearly got their butts kicked in the Yom Kippur War. They're terrified and desperate. Do they have the kind of money to develop this stuff? No. All they can do is go to military contracting meetings and say, I want that and that and that. Okay? Yet they're the ones who show how all of these pieces fit together. They're the ones who managed to brilliantly win a war in a way that no one else could ever have imagined. Same thing with Xerox and Apple. Xerox has every advantage you can think about. They've got more resources than everyone else in Palo Alto combined. Do you know how profitable Xerox Corporation was in the early 1970s, he had 80% market share. One of their earlier copiers is in the Smithsonian. Why? Because it's the highest margin one of the highest margin industrial products ever made. They made a fortune. They threw every dime they had at Xerox PARC, and the result of that was what you would expect, a kind of brilliant, high-level, conceptual innovation. But that level of resources prevented them from developing the kind of attitudes necessary to make something of these ideas. What did you need to be to understand what to do with the mouse? You needed to be hungry and desperate. You needed to be the guy who was running the startup down the road, not the one who was privileged with every bit of resources imaginable. I think about it a lot. I've been recently reading a lot about the golden age of cancer research, which took place at the National Cancer Institute outside of Washington, D.C. in the 1970s and late 1960s. And within a span of about 10 years, we made an astonishing progress against cancer at the NCI. They basically cured 4 cancers that were thought to be incurable: childhood leukemia, Hodgkin's lymphoma, testicular cancer, and some of the large cell lymphomas. It's an astonishing accomplishment. But when you look at the material circumstances of that research at that time, what do you discover? They had no money. Kidding me? A fraction of the money that people in the private sector had. Did they invent anything? Nothing. They didn't invent the drugs. What they did is they went and they took existing drugs and they just tweaked them. They played with combinations and figured things out until they came up with stuff that seemed to work. They were desperate. And as a result, were forced to be imaginative and creative and improvisational in a way that would not have been the case had they been flush with cash. Well, I wonder whether that is a lesson that we've forgotten. And this is my great fear, that in our obsession with being first, in how completely caught up we are in the kind of glory associated with being the originator of an idea, we have taken a series of steps that have made it harder and harder for us to actually profit from those ideas. We have thrown resources at problems that actually need less resources. We have assumed that what we need are a small group of really, really, really smart people, when actually maybe what we need is a lot more not so smart. Right? And we've been in a hurry when we shouldn't be in a hurry. We should be slow. Right? We think we want to be the United States of the Soviet Union, and we don't. We want to be Israel. Thank you.